The abandoned subway tunnels beneath New York City echoed with Sarah's terrified screams as grotesque tentacles wrapped around her ankles, dragging her deeper into the shadows. What lurked in those depths defied explanation. A writhing mass of flesh and fury that had already claimed 3 victims this week. She thrashed against the ropes binding her wrists, certain she'd become the next headline. Then a figure emerged from the darkness, moving with impossible grace and speed. His eyes held ancient wisdom, his hands worked with surgical precision as he severed her bonds. "You're safe now," he whispered, but his voice carried the weight of countless centuries. Dr. Marcus Kane had spent 10,000 years hiding his true identity, the last surviving Homo Sapiens in a world dominated by evolved humans. Tonight, his carefully guarded secret would finally be exposed. As the creature lunged toward them both, Marcus made a choice that would change everything. Not just for Sarah, but for the future of 2 species. But here's what no one saw coming. What if the real monster wasn't the creature in the tunnels? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's freed hands trembled as blood rushed back into her numb fingers. The stranger who'd cut her bonds stood between her and the writhing mass of tentacles, completely motionless except for the subtle rise and fall of his chest. In the dim light filtering down from street grates above, she could see he wasn't particularly tall or muscular, yet something about his presence made the very air feel different, heavier, more charged. "Don't move," Marcus whispered, without turning around. His voice was calm, almost conversational. It hunts by vibration and electrical impulses. "Your fear is like a dinner bell." The creature that had dragged her down here defied every natural law Sarah understood. Its body seemed to shift between solid and liquid, occasionally revealing what might have been eyes or mouths in the roiling flesh. Tentacles writhed outward from its center like angry pythons, each one thick as her torso and covered in some kind of bioluminescent slime that pulsed with an otherworldly blue-green glow. "What is that thing?" Sarah managed to breathe. "Something that shouldn't exist," Marcus replied. "At least, not anymore." He took a single step forward, and the creature responded immediately, rearing up to reveal its true size. It towered nearly 8 feet high, its bulk filling the tunnel from wall to wall. A sound emerged from somewhere within its mass, part screech, part roar, part something that made Sarah's teeth ache. Marcus raised one hand, palm forward, and spoke in a language Sarah had never heard before. The syllables seemed to come from deep in his throat, resonating in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't allow. The creature paused, its tentacles weaving hypnotically in the air. "You're speaking to it," Sarah whispered in disbelief. "Not speaking to it," Marcus corrected, his ancient eyes never leaving the creature. "Speaking to what's controlling it." For a moment, an impossible silence fell over the tunnel. Even the distant rumble of the city above seemed to fade. Then the creature's bioluminescent patches flared bright as searchlights, and it lunged forward with terrifying speed. Marcus moved faster than human reflexes should allow. He spun, sweeping Sarah behind him while simultaneously drawing something from his coat, not a weapon, but a small crystalline device that hummed with energy. As the creature's tentacles lashed toward them, Marcus activated the device. The effect was instantaneous and nauseating. Reality seemed to bend around the crystal, creating a pocket of distorted space between them and the monster. The tentacles struck the distortion and simply stopped, as if they'd hit an invisible wall that existed in more dimensions than Sarah could comprehend. "Temporal displacement field," Marcus explained, though the words meant nothing to her. "It won't hold long." "Who are you?" Sarah gasped, struggling to process what she was witnessing. Marcus glanced back at her, and in that moment, Sarah saw something that chilled her more than the creature ever could. His eyes weren't just old, they were prehistoric, ancient beyond measure, holding memories of things that happened before recorded history began. "I'm what your species used to be," he said simply. "Before the change, before you evolved into something faster, stronger, more intelligent. I'm the last of the original humans." The displacement field flickered, and cracks began to appear in the air itself. The creature sensed weakness and pressed harder against the barrier, its massive bulk straining forward. "That's impossible," Sarah protested. "Homo sapiens went extinct 50,000 years ago. We evolved from them." "You evolved from most of them," Marcus corrected. "A few of us learned to hide, to blend in, to survive by becoming invisible among our own descendants." The field collapsed with a sound like breaking glass. The creature surged forward, but Marcus was already moving, pulling Sarah deeper into the tunnels with inhuman strength. As they ran through the darkness, Sarah realized with growing horror that everything she thought she knew about human evolution, about the history of her species, had been a carefully constructed lie, and the man saving her life was living proof. The coffee shop's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Maya sat hunched over her laptop, her hands still trembling slightly around her third cup of Ethiopian dark roast. Sleep had been impossible after last night's encounter, so she'd fled to the only 24-hour sanctuary she knew, hoping the familiar sounds of grinding beans and quiet conversation would anchor her to reality. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw those impossible violet orbs burning through the darkness. "You look like hell," came a familiar voice. Detective Sarah Chen dropped into the chair across from her, badge glinting on her belt. Maya's oldest friend had that particular expression she wore when trying to decide whether to be concerned or skeptical. "Thanks for the pep talk." Maya attempted to smile, but it felt hollow. "I thought you were working nights this month." "I am. Got your text about needing to talk. What's going on?" Sarah's dark eyes swept over Maya's disheveled appearance. The same clothes from yesterday, hair pulled back in a messy knot, the telltale signs of no sleep. "And don't say nothing. I've known you since college, and you only drink coffee like it's an 4-drip when something's seriously wrong." Maya stared into her cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. How could she possibly explain what had happened? That she'd been saved from some nightmarish creature by a man whose very presence had defied every law of physics she understood. That he'd moved like liquid shadow and spoken with an accent that seemed older than civilization itself. "I was attacked last night," she said finally, "in the alley behind my building." Sarah's posture shifted immediately, cop instincts kicking in. "Maya, why didn't you call this in? Are you hurt? Did you get a look at—" "I'm fine, more or less." Maya held up a hand. "And before you ask, no, I don't want to file a report." "Like hell you don't. What happened?" Maya took a breath and began with the facts she could verify. The late night at the lab, the broken streetlight, the sound of footsteps. She described the feeling of being hunted, the wrongness that had settled in her bones. But when she reached the part about her attacker, the words died in her throat. "It was dark," she said lamely. "I couldn't see much." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "But someone helped me, scared them off." "Them?" "Him, the attacker." Maya was fumbling now, her scientific mind rebelling against the lies even as self-preservation demanded them. "Look, I'm fine, okay? I just needed to process." Sarah leaned back, clearly unsatisfied. "Maya, you're one of the most logical people I know. You don't spook easily, and you sure as hell don't avoid filing reports when someone tries to hurt you. What aren't you telling me?" Before Maya could answer, the bell above the coffee shop door chimed. She glanced up reflexively and nearly dropped her cup. He stood in the doorway, scanning the room with those unsettling violet eyes. In daylight, or at least the harsh glare of fluorescent bulbs, he looked almost normal, almost. Tall, lean, with olive skin and dark hair that caught the light strangely. But there was something in the way he moved, a predatory grace that made her think of apex predators and ancient things. Their eyes met across the crowded shop, and Maya felt that same electric recognition from the night before. He'd found her. Somehow he'd found her. "Maya?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. You look like you've seen a ghost." He was walking toward them now, weaving between tables with fluid precision. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. Part of her wanted to run, but a larger part, the scientist in her, was desperately curious. What did he want? What was he? "Dr. Patel," he said as he reached their table, and his voice carried that same impossible accent, like music played on instruments that no longer existed. "I hope you're feeling better today." Sarah's hand dropped instinctively toward her weapon. "And you are?" "A concerned citizen," he replied smoothly, though his eyes never left Maya's face. "I happened to be in the area when Dr. Patel had her incident last night. I wanted to make sure she was all right." "How did you know where to find me?" Maya managed to ask. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "You mentioned you were a regular here. Lucky guess." She definitely hadn't mentioned that. In fact, she was certain they'd barely spoken at all during those chaotic moments in the alley. "I was hoping we might speak privately," he continued. "There are things about last night that require clarification." Sarah stood abruptly, her hand now resting openly on her holster. "I think any conversation can happen right here, with me present." The stranger's violet gaze shifted to the detective, and Maya saw something dangerous flicker there. Not malice exactly, but a kind of calculating assessment that made her skin crawl. "Of course," he said after a moment. "Though I suspect Dr. Patel has questions that might be difficult to answer in such a public setting." The fluorescent lights in the emergency room cast everything in harsh, clinical whites that made Maya's skin look corpse-pale. She sat on the edge of the examination table, her legs dangling like a child's, while Dr. Hendricks cleaned the gashes on her arms with methodical precision. Each swipe of the antiseptic-soaked gauze sent fire racing up her nerves, but the pain felt distant, muffled by the cotton fog that had settled over her mind since the alley. "You're lucky these aren't deeper," Dr. Hendricks murmured, his weathered face creased with concentration. "Whatever attacked you had claws, but they seem to have just grazed you, like something startled it off before it could do real damage." Maya nodded absently, her gaze fixed on the small window across the room where dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She kept replaying the moments in the alley, the creature's fetid breath, its impossible height, and then the stranger who had appeared like smoke given form, the man who had made the monster flee with nothing more than his presence. "Miss Chen?" Dr. Hendricks was studying her with professional concern. "I asked if you remember anything else about your attacker. The police will want a full statement." "It was dark," she said automatically, the lie sliding off her tongue with practiced ease. "I didn't see much. Just someone in dark clothes, probably a junkie looking for money." The doctor's eyebrows lifted slightly, and he glanced pointedly at the parallel marks on her forearms. The spacing was too wide, the cuts too precise for fingernails. But he said nothing, simply continued his work with the quiet resignation of someone who'd learned not to press too hard for truth in a world that rarely offered it. The door opened with a soft whoosh, and Detective Sarah Morrison stepped inside, her badge clipped to a rumpled blazer that suggested she'd been roused from sleep. Maya recognized her immediately. Morrison had worked her sister Emma's case 3 years ago, back when Maya still believed that monsters were only human. Miss Chen Morrison's voice carried the weight of old grief and newer fatigue. "I'm sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances." Maya managed a weak smile. "Detective Morrison, I didn't expect to see you. Assault cases in the warehouse district get flagged to me automatically now. Too many strange incidents lately." Morrison pulled out a small notebook, the pages yellowed with use. "Dr. Hendricks says you were attacked around 3 a.m. What were you doing in that area so late?" The question Maya had been dreading. She couldn't very well explain that she'd been hunting for Emma's killer based on cryptic clues she'd found in her sister's journal. Clues that pointed to something far more dangerous than a human predator. "I work late shifts at the diner on 5th Street, she said instead. "I was taking a shortcut home." Morrison's pen paused above her notebook. "The diner closes at 11. I stayed to help with inventory. Another lie, but one that Morrison couldn't easily verify at this hour. "Look, detective, I know this seems suspicious, but I just wanted to get home. I took a wrong turn and ended up in that alley, where someone attacked you with what appear to be claws." Morrison's tone remained neutral, but her eyes were sharp with the kind of intelligence that had made her one of the city's best detectives before the strange cases started piling up and wearing her down. Maya felt Dr. Hendrix's hand still on her arm. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and half-formed theories that none of them wanted to voice. Because acknowledging what the evidence suggested meant accepting a reality that didn't fit in police reports or medical textbooks. "I scared him off," Maya said finally. "Started screaming, and he ran." Morrison wrote something in her notebook, but Maya caught the skeptical tilt of her head. "Any description of the attacker?" "Tall, really tall. Maybe 6'5", 6'6". Thin. I couldn't see his face." "His?" Maya hesitated. The creature in the alley had seemed male, but in truth, it had been so far from human that gender felt like an irrelevant concept. "I think so." The build seemed masculine. Morrison nodded and closed her notebook. "We'll patrol the area more heavily for the next few weeks. In the meantime, I'd suggest staying away from that part of town, especially at night. There's been an uptick in violent crimes in the warehouse district." As if on cue, Morrison's radio crackled to life. A dispatcher's voice, tight with stress, reported another incident just 6 blocks from Maya's alley. Something about witnesses, describing an impossibly large figure and injuries consistent with animal attack. Morrison's face went pale. She clipped the radio back to her belt and looked at Maya with eyes that held too much knowledge and too little hope. "Stay safe, Miss Chen, and call me if you remember anything else. Anything at all." The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows across the hospital waiting room as Sarah clutched the discharge papers in trembling hands. 48 hours had passed since that nightmare in the alley, yet the memory felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly immediate. The doctors had found no trace of drugs in her system, no head trauma to explain her hallucinations, and certainly no evidence of the creature that had nearly torn her apart. But the man, Marcus, he'd called himself, had been real enough to carry her to safety. "Miss Chen," the nurse's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Your ride is here." Sarah looked up to see Marcus standing in the doorway, hands buried deep in the pockets of a worn leather jacket. His dark hair caught the harsh lighting, and those strange amber eyes swept the room before settling on her face. He looked perfectly ordinary now, just another face in the crowd, but Sarah couldn't shake the memory of what she'd witnessed in that alley. The way he'd moved, the sounds he'd made, the absolute primal terror in the creature's final moments. "Ready?" His voice carried that same careful control she remembered, each word measured and precise. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd given the hospital his contact information when they'd asked for an emergency contact, though she couldn't quite remember making that decision. The past 2 days blurred together in a haze of medical tests, police interviews, and sleepless hours staring at the ceiling. They walked to the parking garage in silence, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls. Marcus led her to a black motorcycle that looked like it had seen better decades, its chrome dulled and leather seat cracked with age. "I don't have a car," he said simply, offering her a helmet. "Will this work?" "I've never—" Sarah began, then stopped herself. After everything that had happened, worrying about motorcycle safety seemed almost absurd. She took the helmet and climbed on behind him, acutely aware of the solid warmth of his body as she wrapped her arms around his waist. The engine roared to life with a sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones, and they pulled out into the grey afternoon. Seattle's streets blurred past in a kaleidoscope of rain-slicked asphalt and towering glass, but Sarah found herself studying the man in front of her instead of the scenery. There was something wrong with the way he moved, she realized. Not wrong exactly, but different. Too fluid, too precise, like a predator wearing human skin. They pulled up outside her apartment building 20 minutes later, and Sarah slid off the bike on unsteady legs. The familiar sight of her building's brick facade should have been comforting, but everything felt alien now, as if she were seeing the world through different eyes. "We need to talk," Marcus said, removing his helmet and running long fingers through his hair. "About what you saw. What you think you saw." "I know what I saw." Sarah's voice came out steadier than she felt. "That thing in the alley wasn't human. And neither are you." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "You're more observant than most." "Most what?" "Humans." The word hung between them like a blade, sharp and dangerous. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "What are you, then?" Marcus glanced around the busy street, noting the pedestrians and passing cars with predatory awareness. "Not here. Too many eyes, too many ears. Your apartment." Every instinct screamed at her to run, to put distance between herself and this creature masquerading as a man. But a larger part, the part that had kept her working late into dangerous neighborhoods, that had driven her to become an investigative journalist in the first place, needed answers. "Third floor," she said. Her apartment felt smaller with him in it, his presence somehow taking up more space than his physical form should allow. Marcus moved through her living room like he was cataloguing every detail, every possible exit, every potential weapon. When his eyes lingered on the kitchen knives, Sarah's mouth went dry. "Relax," he said without looking at her. "If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have woken up in the hospital." Comforting. He turned then, and in the afternoon light streaming through her windows, his features seemed sharper somehow, more angular. His amber eyes caught the light like an animal's. "My species died out 30,000 years ago," he said quietly, "hunted to extinction by yours. I'm the last." Sarah sank onto her couch, legs suddenly weak. "That's impossible." "Is it? You saw what I did to that thing in the alley. You felt how wrong it was, how unnatural." Marcus moved closer, and she caught a scent like winter forests and old stone. "There are things in this world your kind has forgotten, Sarah. Ancient things, hungry things, and you're one of them." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "No, I'm what stands between them and you." The coffee shop felt surreal after everything that had happened. Elena sat across from Marcus, watching him cradle a steaming mug between those impossibly strong hands that had torn through creatures she couldn't even begin to understand. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his angular features, making him look both more human and somehow less so. "You're not drinking," he observed, nodding toward her untouched latte. "Hard to have an appetite when your entire worldview just got demolished." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, still feeling phantom echoes of those claws that had nearly found her throat. "So what are you exactly? Some kind of evolved human?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. "The opposite, actually. We were here first. Homo sapiens, your species, came later. That's impossible. The archaeological record was written by the victors." His voice carried a weight of ancient sadness. "We've always been good at hiding. Had to be when we realized we were losing the numbers game." Elena leaned forward, her scientific mind warring with the impossibility of what he was telling her. "How many of you are left?" "As far as I know, just me." The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. She'd seen documentaries about endangered species, had felt that distant pang of loss for creatures pushed to extinction. But this was different. This was a person sitting across from her, carrying the weight of being the last of his kind. "Those things in the alley," she said, changing the subject before the full implications could sink in. "What were they?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Hunters. They've been tracking me for decades." "Why now? Why are they coming for you?" "Because something's changed. Something that makes my continued existence problematic for certain parties." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coffee shop's aggressive air conditioning. "What kind of parties?" Before Marcus could answer, His entire body went rigid. His nostrils flared slightly, and his eyes took on that predatory alertness she'd glimpsed in the alley. Without warning, he reached across the table and gripped her wrist. "We need to leave. Now." "What? Why?" The coffee shop's front window exploded inward in a shower of glass and twisted metal. Screams erupted from the other patrons as something massive forced its way through the opening. It moved wrong, all joints bending at impossible angles, covered in what looked like overlapping plates of midnight black chitin. Marcus was already moving, hauling Elena toward the back exit as chaos erupted around them. The creature, because there was no other word for it, swept a clawed appendage across the row of tables, sending chairs and people flying. Elena caught a glimpse of its face, if it could be called that, all compound eyes and clicking mandibles that belonged on something that should have died out with the dinosaurs. "Kitchen!" Marcus shouted, pushing her ahead of him as the thing let out a sound like grinding metal. The coffee shop employees scattered, abandoning their stations as the creature began systematically, destroying everything in its path. Elena stumbled through the kitchen doors, Marcus close behind. She could hear the thing following, its movements accompanied by the sharp scrape of claws on tile. "Back door," Marcus demanded. "There." Elena pointed to the emergency exit just as the kitchen doors burst open behind them. They ran. Elena's lungs burned as they emerged into the alley behind the coffee shop, her legs feeling like water after the adrenaline spike. Marcus grabbed her hand, pulling her along streets she didn't recognize, taking turns that seemed random but were clearly purposeful. Behind them, something roared, a sound that made her bones ache. "Your car," Marcus said as they reached the main street. "Where is it?" "2 blocks north, but keys." Elena fumbled in her pocket, her hands shaking as she handed them over. Marcus took them without breaking stride, his breathing steady despite their sprint. How was he not even winded? They reached her Honda just as Elena heard the distinctive sound of concrete cracking somewhere behind them. Marcus had the car started before she'd even gotten her seatbelt fastened. "What the hell was that thing?" she gasped as he pulled into traffic with practiced ease. "A seeker." "They're not native to this world." Elena stared at him. "Not native to... You mean they're aliens?" Among other things, Marcus checked the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. "The situation is more complicated than I initially thought." "Complicated how? They're not just hunting me anymore. By being seen with me, by surviving that first attack, you've become a target too." The words settled over Elena like ice water. She thought about her apartment, her job, her normal life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. So what happens now? Marcus met her eyes in the mirror, and she saw something there she couldn't quite identify, determination mixed with something that might have been hope. "Now we disappear, and I teach you how to fight back." The laboratory beneath Marcus's bookstore defied every assumption Sarah had made about the quiet antiquarian. Banks of monitors displaying incomprehensible data cascaded down one wall, while specimen containers filled with luminescent samples lined metal shelving units. The air hummed with the subtle vibration of machinery she couldn't identify. "This is impossible," she whispered, following Marcus down a corridor that stretched further than the building's footprint should have allowed. "How long has this been here?" "I began construction in 1847, Marcus replied without looking back. Though the excavation took nearly 30 years to complete properly, Sarah's mind reeled. The timeline made no sense, but after witnessing Marcus's impossible speed and strength against the creature, she found herself accepting impossibilities with disturbing ease. "What are you researching down here?" Marcus paused before a sealed chamber marked with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Them, the vanguard, as I've come to call them, though they have many names across many cultures. Through the reinforced glass, Sarah saw what appeared to be biological samples suspended in some kind of preservation medium. The specimens pulsed with the same sickly phosphorescence she'd seen in the creature's eyes. "How many are there?" she asked. "Unknown," They don't reproduce in any conventional sense. They're summoned, created through rituals that require specific conditions. Marcus's jaw tightened. Conditions that are becoming increasingly common in your modern world. My modern world? You talk like you're not part of it. Marcus turned to face her fully, and in the laboratory's harsh lighting, she noticed details she'd missed before. His skin had an almost luminous quality, and his eyes held depths that seemed older than his apparent age suggested. "Because I'm not," he said simply. "Homo sapiens evolved alongside my people for thousands of years. We were your guardians, your protectors against things that hunted in the darkness. But we were also different enough that coexistence became complicated." Sarah backed against the corridor wall as the implications crashed over her. "You're not human." "I'm human, just not the same species as you." Marcus's expression remained carefully neutral. Homo magnus. We were stronger, faster, longer-lived, and we could see the dimensional rifts that allowed creatures like the vanguard to cross over. Were? The single word seemed to age Marcus before her eyes. A plague swept through our communities in the 14th century, something engineered by those who feared our influence. Within a generation, we went from thousands to hundreds, by the 16th century dozens. I haven't encountered another of my kind in over 200 years. Sarah stared at the specimen containers, her scientific mind struggling to process the revelation. "So you're the last one?" "As far as I know." Marcus moved to a control panel, his fingers dancing across interfaces that responded to his touch with musical tones, which makes what's happening now particularly concerning. The monitors around them flickered to life, displaying a map of the city dotted with pulsing red indicators. Sarah counted at least 30 markers, concentrated in areas she recognized as industrial districts and abandoned buildings. "These are emergence sites," Marcus explained. "Places where the vanguard have been manifesting with increasing frequency over the past 6 months. The pattern suggests someone is deliberately opening rifts, someone who knows what they're doing, someone who understands the old rituals. The question is whether they're human or something else entirely." Marcus pulled up another display showing electromagnetic readings that spiked dramatically at each marked location. "The energy signatures are consistent with pre-Columbian summoning practices, but the scale is unprecedented." Sarah studied the data, her background in emergency medicine providing unexpected context. "These dates, they correspond with the missing persons reports I've been tracking, people disappearing from these exact areas." Marcus went very still. "What missing persons reports?" "Part of my work involves coordinating with police on trauma cases. I'd noticed a pattern of disappearances, people vanishing without traces of violence or struggle. I thought it was human trafficking, but—" She gestured at the monitors. "This explains why we never found bodies." "The vanguard consume life force, not flesh," Marcus confirmed grimly. "They drain their victims completely, leaving nothing behind but trace minerals. It's how they sustain themselves in our dimension." A new alarm began chiming, and one of the red indicators on the map flashed urgently. Marcus cursed in a language Sarah didn't recognize. "Another emergence event," he said, moving toward what appeared to be an equipment locker. "And this one's close. You're going after it." "I have to. It's what I was born to do." Marcus began pulling on what looked like tactical gear, though the materials seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. "The question is whether you're going home or coming with me." Sarah looked at the monitors, at the evidence of horrors stalking her city while she'd remained obliviously focused on human dangers. The rational part of her mind screamed to run, to return to her normal life and pretend none of this was real. Instead, she found herself asking, "What do you need me to do?" The abandoned subway tunnels stretched endlessly into darkness, illuminated only by Marcus's unnaturally keen eyes and the dying battery of Sarah's phone. Their footsteps echoed against wet concrete as they moved deeper underground, following what Marcus claimed were traces invisible to human senses. "How much further?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant dripping of water through rusted pipes. Marcus paused, tilting his head with that peculiar stillness she was beginning to recognize. When he moved like that, she could almost see the predator lurking beneath his human facade, something ancient and deadly that had survived when his entire species had not. "Close," he murmured. "Very close. The scent is stronger here." Sarah's skin crawled. She'd been trying not to think about what that meant, about what they might find in these tunnels. The creature that had attacked her 3 nights ago wasn't alone. Marcus had made that much clear, though he'd been frustratingly vague about the details. A sound echoed from ahead, a wet sliding noise that made Sarah's blood freeze. Marcus's hand shot out, pressing against her chest to stop her movement. His fingers were cold through her jacket, and she could feel the unnatural strength in them, the careful restraint he maintained, even in his urgency. "Stay behind me," he breathed, and something shifted in his posture. The human mask he wore so carefully began to slip. Sarah watched in fascination and growing terror as Marcus's form seemed to elongate in the shadows. His movements became fluid, predatory, and when he turned his head to look back at her, his eyes reflected the dim light like polished silver. "What are you?" she whispered, not for the first time. "Survival," he replied, and then he was moving forward with impossible grace. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, one of the old maintenance areas long forgotten by the city above. Sarah's phone light swept across the space, revealing the horror within. Bodies hung from the ceiling like grotesque cocoons, wrapped in some kind of translucent membrane that pulsed with sickly bioluminescence. Some of the forms were still moving, twitching weakly within their prisons. Sarah counted at least a dozen before her mind refused to process more. "Oh, God," she choked, stumbling backward. But Marcus was studying the scene with clinical detachment, his enhanced senses cataloguing details she couldn't perceive. 3 days old, maybe 4. They're still in the incubation stage. "Incubation?" Sarah's voice cracked. "What are those things?" Before Marcus could answer, the shadows at the far end of the chamber began to move, not the ordinary shifting of darkness, but something deliberate and malevolent. Sarah's phone light caught glimpses of wet, segmented flesh and too many joints bending in impossible directions. The creature that emerged was worse than the one from the alley. Larger, more developed, with sensory organs that waved like obscene antennae from what might have been its head. When it opened what served as its mouth, rows of needle-sharp teeth glistened with acidic saliva that hissed where it hit the concrete. "Breeder," Marcus said, and all pretense of humanity vanished from his voice. The transformation was terrifying to witness. Marcus's human shell seemed to dissolve, revealing something that belonged to nightmares and evolutionary dead ends. His limbs lengthened, his spine curved into a predatory arch, and when his own mouth opened, Sarah saw fangs that could punch through steel. The two monsters circled each other in the Chamber of Horrors, and Sarah realized she was witnessing something that hadn't occurred for thousands of years, a battle between apex predators, each representing a branch of evolution that had diverged long before humans learned to make fire. The breeder struck first, its segmented limbs lashing out with razor-sharp appendages. Marcus moved like liquid shadow, avoiding the attack and countering with claws that opened deep furrows in his opponent's armored hide. Black ichor sprayed across the chamber walls. Sarah pressed herself against the tunnel entrance, simultaneously wanting to flee and unable to look away. This was what Marcus really was beneath his careful human disguise, not her savior, but something equally monstrous, equally alien. The only difference was that he had chosen to protect rather than devour. The battle was swift and brutal. Marcus's species had been the apex predator for a reason, and even reduced to a single survivor, that genetic legacy remained intact. He moved with precision born of millennia of hunting, every strike calculated to inflict maximum damage. When it was over, the breeder lay twitching in spreading pools of its own acidic blood. Marcus stood over it, his transformed features savage in the phone's fading light, breathing hard through nostrils that no longer looked entirely human. Slowly, carefully, he began to shift back to his human appearance, though something wild still lurked in his silver eyes. "We need to burn this place," he said, his voice rough, all of it, before the others hatch. Sarah stared at the cocoons still hanging from the ceiling, at the slowly dying creature at Marcus's feet, at the man who wasn't a man standing amid the carnage. "How many more are out there?" she asked. Marcus's smile held no comfort. "Enough." The abandoned subway tunnel stretched endlessly into darkness, its walls weeping with decades of moisture and neglect. Sarah's footsteps echoed alongside Kyle's silent movement, creating an unsettling rhythm that seemed to mock her mortality. Every shadow could hide another wraith, every sound could herald their doom. "The scent grows stronger," Kyle murmured, his enhanced senses tracking something she couldn't perceive. "They've been hunting here recently." Sarah suppressed a shudder. 3 days had passed since their escape from her apartment. 3 days of running through the city's forgotten arteries, while Kyle explained the impossible truth of his existence. The last Neanderthal, he'd called himself, though the term felt inadequate for what he truly was, something evolved beyond her understanding, shaped by millennia of hiding and surviving. "How many?" she whispered, though she dreaded the answer. Kyle paused, his nostrils flaring slightly. "At least 6, maybe more." His pale eyes caught the dim light filtering through a grate above. "They're coordinating their hunt patterns, learning." The word sent ice through Sarah's veins. The wraiths weren't just predators, they were adaptable ones. Each encounter taught them more about their prey, made them deadlier. A distant screech echoed from somewhere ahead, immediately answered by another from behind them. Sarah's breath caught as the sounds multiplied, creating a symphony of hunger that seemed to surround them. "They know we're here," Kyle said, his voice carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. Something that might have been fear, if creatures like him could feel such things. "Then we run?" Kyle turned to face her, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression, a hardening that transformed his features into something predatory. "Running only delays the inevitable. It's time you learned what I really am." His spine straightened, adding inches to his already impressive height. Muscles beneath his clothing rippled and expanded, and when he smiled, Sarah glimpsed teeth that were decidedly not human. The transformation was subtle yet profound, as if he'd been wearing a carefully constructed disguise that was finally falling away. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice deeper now, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Sarah's bones. The wraith launched itself forward with inhuman speed, but Kyle moved faster. Sarah's eyes could barely track the collision. One moment the creature was airborne, claws extended, the next it was crashing into the tunnel wall with bone-crushing force. Kyle had intercepted it mid-leap, his hands wrapped around its throat with devastating efficiency. The wraith's death cry brought the others. They poured from the shadows like liquid nightmare. 4, 5, 6 of them converging on Kyle's position with coordinated precision. Sarah pressed herself against the tunnel wall, watching in horrified fascination as humanity's secret guardian revealed his true nature. Kyle moved like violence personified. His strikes carried the weight of millennia, each blow calculated to maximum effect. When claws raked across his shoulder, drawing dark blood, he didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed his attacker and drove it face first into the concrete with enough force to crack the foundation. But for every wraith he destroyed, another seemed to take its place. Sarah realized with growing horror that more were emerging from the darkness, not 6 but a dozen or more. The tunnel had become a bottleneck, and they were trapped at its center. "Kale!" she screamed as 3 wraiths coordinated an attack from different angles. He spun to face the threat, but Sarah saw the calculation in his movements change. He was being overwhelmed. For the first time since their flight began, she witnessed something that might have been uncertainty cross his features. One of the creatures broke through his guard, its claws raking across his chest. Dark blood splattered the tunnel floor, and Kyle stumbled backward. The wraiths pressed their advantage, sensing weakness in their ancient enemy. Sarah's mind raced. Everything Kyle had told her about the wraiths, about their nature and weaknesses, crystallized into desperate inspiration. Without thinking, she grabbed a piece of broken concrete and hurled it at the overhead grate. The metal clanged loudly, and brilliant afternoon sunlight suddenly streamed into the tunnel. The effect was immediate and devastating. The wraiths recoiled with agonized shrieks, their forms seeming to waver and diminish in the harsh illumination. Kyle seized the moment. Moving with renewed fury, he systematically destroyed the remaining creatures while they writhed in the light's painful embrace. Within moments, the tunnel fell silent, except for their labored breathing. "Clever," Kyle said, examining his wounds. "They were already beginning to close, though that won't work again. They'll remember." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. The wraiths were learning, adapting to every strategy they employed. Soon, even Kyle's supernatural abilities might not be enough to protect them. "Then we need to find another way," she said, surprising herself with her resolve. "Because I'm not giving up." The laboratory's sterile white walls felt like a tomb as Maya watched Kyle move between the ancient artifacts and modern equipment with unsettling familiarity. His fingers traced the surface of a crystalline device that hummed with energy she couldn't comprehend, responding to his touch as if recognizing an old friend. "These aren't just weapons," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're part of you somehow." Kyle's pale eyes met hers across the room. Every umbral is born with a neural resonance frequency. These tools were crafted to amplify what we already possessed. He lifted a slender rod that began to glow with the same ethereal light she'd seen emanate from his skin. "Your species calls it supernatural. For us, it was simply evolution." The implications crashed over her like a tide. "How many of you are left?" "One." The word fell between them with the weight of extinction. The others chose to fade rather than adapt. They believed hiding was cowardice. His laugh held no humor. Perhaps they were right. Maya stepped closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. The air around Kyle shimmered with barely contained energy, and she could feel it pulling at something deep within her chest. "But you chose differently." "I chose survival. I chose to wait." He set down the crystalline rod and turned to face her fully. "The question is whether I waited too long." Before she could ask what he meant, alarms began shrieking throughout the facility. Red lights bathed the laboratory in hellish illumination as automated voices announced a containment breach. Maya's blood turned to ice as she recognized the sector designation, the same level where Dr. Harrison's team had been conducting their experiments. "They're loose," she breathed, memories of razor-sharp claws and impossible speed flooding back. Kyle was already moving, his earlier melancholy replaced by predatory focus. He gathered several of the alien devices, his movements fluid and purposeful. "Not loose, released." "What do you mean, released?" "Harrison isn't just studying the Scraith, he's breeding them." Kyle's expression darkened. "And now he's using them to flush us out." The laboratory door exploded inward, twisted metal flying like shrapnel. Through the smoking wreckage came something that had once been human, but was no longer recognizable as such. Its elongated limbs ended in obsidian claws, its face a nightmare fusion of exposed bone and writhing flesh. But it was the intelligence in its coal-black eyes that made Maya's knees buckle. This thing was aware, calculating. Kyle stepped in front of her, the crystalline rod blazing to life in his grip. "Hybrid," he spat. "Harrison's been combining human and Scraith DNA." The creature spoke, its voice a wet rasp that seemed to come from multiple throats. The last, umbral. "The doctor will be pleased." Maya pressed herself against the far wall as Kyle raised the glowing weapon. The hybrid moved with inhuman speed, but Kyle was faster. Light erupted from the rod in a coherent beam that struck the creature center mass, sending it crashing into the corridor beyond. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. "Move," Kyle commanded, grabbing Maya's hand and pulling her toward a secondary exit she hadn't noticed. His skin was blazing now, casting dancing shadows on the walls as more shapes appeared in the main doorway. They ran through twisting corridors as the facility descended into chaos around them. Emergency lights flickered and died, leaving only Kyle's luminescence to guide their way. Behind them, inhuman shrieks echoed through the darkness, growing closer with each passing second. There, Kyle pointed to an unmarked door at the end of a narrow hallway. Service elevator. It leads to the surface. But as they reached the door, Maya felt compelled to look back. What she saw made her stumble. Dr. Harrison stood at the far end of the corridor, flanked by 3 more of the hybrid monstrosities. But it was Harrison himself who truly horrified her. His left arm had been replaced by something segmented and chitinous, ending in claws that gleamed like black diamonds. "Mr. Kale," Harrison called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance, or should I say, the last of the umbral race. "You have something that belongs to me." Kyle's grip on Maya's hand tightened. "I belong to no one, abomination." Harrison's laugh was like breaking glass. "Not you, her." He gestured with his transformed limb toward Maya. "Did you really think her survival was coincidence? That she just happened to encounter a scraith and live to tell about it? We've been watching her bloodline for generations." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. "Bloodline. Run," Kyle whispered urgently, but Maya found herself rooted in place, staring at Harrison's twisted smile. "She's the key, Kyle. Human enough to survive the process, but with just enough umbral ancestry to interface with your technology. The perfect hybrid template." Harrison's eyes gleamed with fanatic fervor. "She's how we'll breed a new master race." The corridor erupted into violence as Kyle's luminescence flared to blinding intensity and the hybrids charged forward with inhuman speed. The abandoned subway tunnel stretched endlessly into darkness, its walls weeping with decades of moisture and decay. Sarah's breathing echoed off the curved concrete as she followed Kyle deeper into the forgotten arteries of the city. The emergency lights they'd rigged cast dancing shadows that made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to focus on his broad shoulders moving ahead of her. "How much further?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure why she bothered keeping her voice down. If the shadows had found them again, whispering wouldn't save them. Kyle raised his hand for silence, his head tilted in that predatory way that reminded her he wasn't entirely human. His enhanced hearing picked up frequencies she couldn't even imagine. After a long moment, he relaxed slightly and turned to face her. "We're close. The entrance is hidden behind a maintenance panel about 50 meters ahead." His eyes caught the light strangely in the darkness, reflecting it back like an animal's. "Sarah, before we go any further, there are things you need to understand about my people, about what you're walking into." She leaned against the tunnel wall, grateful for the brief rest. The past week had been a blur of running, hiding, and learning that everything she thought she knew about the world was wrong. "I'm listening. The remnant, what's left of my kind, they've survived by being invisible. For 3,000 years we've lived in the spaces between your world. We've watched civilizations rise and fall, seen empires crumble to dust. We've learned to be ghosts." A distant rumble echoed through the tunnel, probably just a train on an active line, but Sarah's nerves were frayed enough that she jumped. Kyle noticed and moved closer, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "How many of you are left?" she asked. "Fewer than you might hope, more than the shadows suspect." His jaw tightened. "We stopped counting exact numbers long ago. It became too painful watching the count decrease year by year." Sarah studied his profile in the dim light. She'd grown accustomed to his otherworldly features, the slightly elongated proportions, the way his movements seemed too fluid for normal human joints, the uncanny stillness when he listened. But it was the weight of sorrow in his expression that struck her most, the loneliness of being the last of anything. "They won't trust you," Kyle continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Humans have brought nothing but danger to us. Every time we've tried to make contact, every time we've attempted to help your species, it's ended in betrayal or disaster. Then why are you helping me? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were translating thoughts from some ancient language. Because the shadows aren't just hunting you anymore, they're preparing for something bigger, something that will make the difference between human and Homo superior irrelevant. He met her eyes. Because despite everything my people have suffered at human hands, I can't watch your entire species burn. The weight of his admission settled between them. Sarah realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale. What are they preparing for? We'll know more once we reach the others, but the patterns we've observed, the way they've been moving, he shook his head. They're not just eliminating witnesses anymore. They're collecting something, or someone. A chill that had nothing to do with the underground cold crawled up Sarah's spine. Collecting people? People with specific genetic markers, bloodlines that trace back to the early days when our species lived side by side. Kyle's expression darkened. They tested your blood, didn't they? When you were in their facility? Sarah's hand instinctively went to her arm, where the needle marks had finally faded. How did you know? Because you survived their initial contact. Because you can see them even when they're using their camouflage technology. Because... He stopped abruptly, his head snapping toward the tunnel entrance behind them. The silence that followed was absolute. No dripping water, no distant train sounds, nothing. Sarah's pulse hammered in her throat as she strained to hear whatever had caught Kyle's attention. Then she heard it, a soft scraping sound like claws on concrete, coming from the direction they'd entered. Multiple sets of claws. Kyle's hand found her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. We run. Now. They sprinted through the darkness, emergency lights creating a strobe effect as they passed. Behind them, the scraping sounds multiplied, joined by something that might have been breathing or might have been the whisper of fabric against stone. Sarah didn't look back. She'd learned that looking back only showed you how close death was following. The maintenance panel appeared in their light beam like salvation itself. Kyle's fingers found hidden latches with practiced ease, and the seemingly solid concrete swung inward on silent hinges. Through here, he urged, ushering her into an even deeper darkness. Whatever happens next, remember, trust nothing that looks human unless I vouch for them. Among the remnant, appearances are never what they seem. The safe house felt like a tomb carved from steel and shadow. Elena sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, her fingers tracing the strange symbols Kyle had etched into the walls during their 3 days of hiding. The markings pulsed with a faint bioluminescent glow, creating patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. They're not just decorative, Kyle said, without turning from the bank of monitors where he tracked the Devourer's movements across the city. Each symbol contains genetic code, memories encoded in living light. Elena pressed her palm against one of the larger glyphs. Warmth spread through her fingers, and for a moment she glimpsed flashes of images, vast cities built into mountain faces, beings that looked almost human but moved with impossible grace, skies filled with creatures that defied physics. Your people, she whispered. What's left of them? His voice carried the weight of millennia. The Homo Sapiens never knew we existed alongside them. We called ourselves the Altari, the first walkers. We shaped ourselves to survive anything, even the end of worlds. The monitors flickered, showing heat signatures moving through the subway tunnels below. The Devourers had evolved since their last encounter, their forms more cohesive, more purposeful. Where once they moved like mindless predators, now they exhibited pack-hunting behaviors that made Elena's blood run cold. They're learning, she said. Faster than I anticipated. Kyle's fingers danced across holographic interfaces that materialized from thin air. The ones that consumed parts of me have been sharing the genetic information. They're developing resistance to my abilities. Elena watched the creatures on screen, noting how they now avoided the light sources that had previously sent them fleeing. Their writhing forms had developed what looked like protective membranes, and their movements showed tactical awareness. How long before they find us? Hours, maybe less. Kyle turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression she'd never witnessed before: uncertainty. There's something else you need to know about why they're changing so rapidly. The safe house shuddered as something massive struck the reinforced walls above them. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the lights flickered. In the distance, Elena could hear screaming, not human screams, but something far worse. The devourers were calling to each other. "The genetic material they absorbed from me," Kyle continued, his voice steady despite the chaos beginning above. "It's not just giving them resistance. It's giving them access to Altari biotechnology. They're rebuilding themselves into something new." Another impact shook the structure. The monitors showed hundreds of heat signatures converging on their location from every direction. The creatures moved through the earth itself now, boring tunnels with acid secretions Elena hadn't seen them use before. "We need to leave," she said, grabbing the pack of supplies they'd prepared. "There's nowhere left to run." Kyle's hand closed around a crystalline device that had been growing on his workbench for the past day. "They've surrounded the entire district. But there is another option." The crystal pulsed with the same light as the wall symbols, but brighter, more intense. Elena felt its energy from across the room, ancient power that made her teeth ache and her vision blur at the edges. "What is that?" "A genetic reset key, the last failsafe my people built before they died out." His fingers tightened around the device. "It can rewrite the DNA of any organism within a 50-mile radius, returning it to its original template. The devourers would revert to whatever they were before the mutation." The ceiling cracked, revealing glimpses of writhing darkness above. Elena heard the wet sounds of the creatures forcing their way through concrete and steel. They would be inside within minutes. "But?" she asked, knowing there had to be a cost. "But it requires the complete genetic dissolution of an Altari to power it. I would cease to exist, not just physically, but at a molecular level. Every trace of my people's legacy would die with me." Elena stared at the crystal, understanding flooding through her. "You'd be committing genocide against your own species." "A species of one." The bitter irony in his voice cut through the noise of their sanctuary being torn apart. "The question is whether one extinct race is worth saving a living one." The wall symbols began flashing in rapid sequence, and Elena realized they were some kind of proximity alarm. The devourers had found them. She could hear their clicking communications echoing through the walls, coordinated and intelligent in a way that terrified her more than their previous mindless hunger. Kyle held up the crystal, its light casting strange shadows across his face. For a moment, Elena saw him as he truly was, not the carefully constructed human facade, but something otherworldly and magnificent. The last remnant of a civilization that had watched the rise and fall of countless worlds. Above them, the ceiling finally gave way with a sound like breaking bones. The underground chamber stretched endlessly before them, its walls carved from living rock and adorned with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Maya's breath caught as she followed Kyle deeper into what he called the archive, a repository of knowledge that predated written history by millennia. "Your people built all this," she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Built, preserved, protected." Kyle's fingers traced one of the glowing symbols, and suddenly the air shimmered with holographic displays. Images of Earth as it once was materialized around them. Forests that covered continents, oceans teeming with life forms she'd never seen, and cities that defied physics with their impossible architecture. Maya staggered backward as a projection of enormous creatures swept overhead, their bodies translucent and graceful, moving through the air like jellyfish through water. What were those? The ethereals. They were the first to fall when the devourers arrived. Kyle's expression darkened as he manipulated the display, showing the same graceful beings suddenly writhing in agony, their bodies dissolving into writhing black masses. The devourers don't just consume flesh, they corrupt everything they touch, turning beauty into nightmare. The hologram shifted, revealing a planet-wide war unlike anything from human history. Massive beings wielding energy weapons faced off against the writhing darkness Maya now recognized as the creatures that had hunted them through the tunnels. But these devourers were different, larger, more organized, clearly intelligent in their malevolence. How many species did they destroy? Dozens, perhaps hundreds. Kyle's hand moved again, and the display zoomed in on a group of humanoid figures fighting desperately against the encroaching darkness. They moved with impossible speed and grace, their bodies glowing with the same inner light as the chamber walls. My people, the Luminari, were among the last to fall. We thought our ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level would save us. Maya watched in horrified fascination as the Luminari warriors literally reshaped the battlefield around them, turning stone to liquid, air to solid barriers. But for every devourer they destroyed, 3 more emerged from the corpses of the fallen. The final battle lasted 3 days, Kyle continued, his voice heavy with ancient grief. We managed to wound their nexus, their collective consciousness, badly enough to force them into hibernation. But the cost. The display showed a planet scoured nearly clean of life, its surface cratered and burning. You survived. Barely. A few hundred of us went into deep hiding, using our abilities to blend with the primitive humans who had somehow escaped the worst of the slaughter. The projection changed again, showing early humans cowering in caves while ethereal figures watched over them from the shadows. We became their silent guardians, guiding their evolution, preparing them for the day the devourers would return. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. You've been manipulating human development for thousands of years? Not manipulating, nurturing. Kyle turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the chamber's strange light. Your species has so much potential, Maya. The capacity for both creation and destruction, for love and sacrifice. We hoped that when the devourers awakened, humanity would be ready to stand with us. The holographic display shifted one final time, showing the present day. The familiar outline of their city appeared, but Maya could see pulsing red dots spreading beneath its streets like an infection. They're awakening now. The disturbance in the old subway tunnels 3 days ago triggered their emergence protocols. They've been feeding, growing stronger, preparing for full awakening. Kyle's jaw tightened. I estimate we have perhaps 48 hours before they reach critical mass. And then? Then they'll burst onto the surface and begin the harvest. 7 billion humans will become hosts for their spawn, and Earth will become another dead world in their collection. Maya sank onto a carved stone bench, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. Why me? Why did you save me specifically? Kyle knelt before her, his expression intense. Because you're not entirely human, Maya. The genetic markers we embedded in early humanity have been dormant for millennia, but they're starting to activate. The stress of the encounter triggered something in your DNA, something that makes you capable of interfacing with our technology. He gestured at the chamber around them. All of this is useless without someone who can operate it. My people are gone. I'm the last. But you have the potential to become what we were, to wield the power necessary to face the devourers. Maya stared at her hands, remembering the strange sensations she'd experienced during their escape. The warmth I felt, the way I could sense things in the darkness. Your abilities awakening. With training, you could learn to manipulate matter like I do, to move faster than human eyes can follow, to interface directly with technology that could level the playing field. The weight of destiny settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. How long do we have to prepare? Kyle's smile was grim. We start now. The abandoned subway tunnels stretched endlessly in both directions, their concrete walls weeping with decades of accumulated moisture. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as she followed Kyle deeper into the forgotten infrastructure beneath the city. The emergency broadcast had been clear: all surface dwellers were to remain in designated safe zones. But those zones were exactly where the creatures were hunting. How much further? She whispered, her voice echoing despite her efforts to stay quiet. Kyle moved with fluid precision ahead of her, his enhanced senses constantly scanning for threats. The sanctuary is 3 miles ahead. My people built it during the construction of the original subway system in 1904. The humans thought we were just unusually skilled workers. Sarah stumbled over a piece of broken concrete, catching herself against the tunnel wall. The surface was covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in her peripheral vision. When she looked directly at them, they appeared to be simple scratches in the stone. "Don't stare at the markers," Kyle warned without turning around. "Your human brain isn't equipped to process them directly. They're warning signs, telling others of my kind about the dangers that lurk in specific tunnel sections." A distant screech reverberated through the tunnels behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. Sarah's pulse quickened. The creatures had found their trail. "They're coming," she breathed. Kyle stopped abruptly, his head tilted as he listened to sounds Sarah couldn't detect. His expression darkened. 3 of them. Moving fast, he turned to face her, his ancient eyes reflecting her flashlight like mirrors. "Sarah, I need you to trust me completely. What I'm about to do will terrify you, but it's the only way we survive this." Before she could respond, Kyle's form began to shift. His skin rippled like water, bones restructuring themselves with wet, organic sounds that made Sarah's stomach lurch. His limbs elongated, muscles expanding beneath flesh that had taken on a translucent quality. Most disturbing of all, additional appendages emerged from his torso, 6 writhing tentacles that ended in blade-like projections. Sarah's rational mind screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to remain still. This was Kyle, the same being who had saved her life, who had shown her gentleness despite his alien nature. The creature that had been Kyle moved past her with inhuman grace, positioning himself between Sarah and the approaching sounds. When the first monstrosity rounded the tunnel bend, a writhing mass of teeth and shadow that defied geometric logic, Kyle met it with explosive violence. The battle was unlike anything Sarah had witnessed. Both creatures moved at impossible speeds, their forms blurring as they collided with bone-crushing force. Kyle's blade appendages sliced through his opponent with surgical precision, while his elongated limbs grappled with others that emerged from the darkness. The tunnel filled with sounds that had no earthly equivalent, wet tears, metallic shrieks, and the percussion of bodies slamming into concrete. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her flashlight beam wavering as her hands shook. Kyle fought with the accumulated experience of millennia, each movement calculated and deadly. But the creatures seemed to anticipate his attacks, adapting their forms to counter his strategies. Sarah realized with growing horror that these beings shared some fundamental connection with Kyle. They knew how he fought because they understood what he was. "You cannot protect her forever, brother," one of the creatures spoke, its voice a harmony of discordant tones. "She is the key, and the old masters demand her return." "The old masters are dead," Kyle snarled, driving his blades deep into the speaker's core. "I made certain of that, did you?" Another creature materialized from the ceiling, dropping silently behind Sarah. Kyle's warning cry came too late. Tentacles wrapped around Sarah's torso, lifting her from the ground. But instead of tearing her apart as she expected, the creature began to probe her mind. Images flooded her consciousness, visions of vast cities beneath the earth, populated by beings that shared Kyle's fundamental nature, but possessed none of his restraint. She saw the truth of what she was, not just a random victim, but a descendant of humans who had been deliberately altered by Kyle's people centuries ago. Her bloodline carried genetic markers that could unlock technologies her ancestors had sealed away, technologies powerful enough to reshape reality itself. The mental probe withdrew abruptly as Kyle's blade punched through the creature's skull. Sarah dropped to the tunnel floor, gasping and disoriented. "The sanctuary," Kyle said urgently, already returning to his human appearance. "We have to reach it before more arrive." But as they ran through the darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the images she had seen. The creatures weren't just hunting her, they were reclaiming her. And somewhere in the depths beneath the city, something vast and patient was beginning to stir, awakened by the knowledge that its key had finally been found. The tunnel ahead branched into multiple passages, and Sarah realized they were entering a maze that predated human civilization entirely. The ancient chamber beneath the abandoned factory hummed with otherworldly energy as Maya watched Kyle interface with technology that predated human civilization by thousands of years. His fingers danced across crystalline surfaces that responded to his touch with cascades of bioluminescent light, and she could feel the power radiating from the alien machinery like heat from a forge. "The neural pathways are still intact," Kyle murmured, his voice carrying both relief and grim determination. "I can reverse what they've done to the infected, but it requires a complete system reboot. Every parasitic entity currently inhabiting a human host will be simultaneously severed from its neural anchor." Maya stepped closer, avoiding the pulsing cables that snaked across the floor like living things. "That sounds like exactly what we want. What's the catch?" Kyle's expression darkened as holographic displays materialized around them, showing a three-dimensional map of the city above. Red dots pulsed throughout the grid, thousands of them, each representing an infected human. The severing process will be violent. The parasites won't simply release their hosts. They'll fight back with everything they have in those final moments. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning every infected person in the city will experience what amounts to a neural seizure. Some will survive it. Others... He gestured helplessly. "I cannot predict the mortality rate. It could be 20%, it could be 80%. The weight of that revelation settled over Maya like a crushing blanket. Save some by sacrificing others, the kind of impossible choice she'd hoped to avoid. Through the comm device Kyle had given her, she could hear Marcus and his team fighting somewhere in the tunnels above, their ammunition running low as more infected poured into the underground complex. "There has to be another way," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. "I spent 3 millennia searching for alternatives," Kyle replied, his ancient eyes reflecting the chamber's strange light. "This technology was designed as a fail-safe, a final solution when all other containment measures failed. The architects built it knowing they might someday need to choose between losing some of their people and losing all of them." An explosion echoed through the chamber, close enough to rain dust from the ceiling. Maya's comm crackled with Marcus's voice, strained and desperate. "Maya, whatever you're doing down there, you need to do it fast. We've got maybe 10 minutes before we're completely overrun." She looked at the red dots covering the holographic city map, each one a person whose fate now rested in her hands. Men, women, children, all of them innocent victims of an invasion that had begun long before any of them were born. But beyond the city limits, she knew the infection was spreading. By tomorrow, those red dots would cover the state. By next week, the continent. "If we don't do this," she said, "how long before everyone is infected?" Kyle manipulated the hologram, showing projection models that made Maya's stomach turn. The red spread like spilled blood across maps of the world. At current infection rates, total global saturation within 6 months. The species that created these parasites consumed 17 worlds before we stopped them. Earth would be the 18th. Maya closed her eyes and thought of her sister Sarah, probably asleep in her apartment across town, unaware that humanity stood on the brink of extinction. She thought of everyone she'd ever known, everyone she'd ever loved, and weighed their futures against the lives of the infected. When she opened her eyes, her resolve had crystallized into something harder than diamond. "Do it." Kyle studied her face for a long moment, perhaps seeing something there that convinced him she truly understood the magnitude of what she was authorizing. He nodded once, then turned back to the alien console. "The activation sequence requires biological authentication from both of us," he explained, his hands moving to different sections of the crystalline interface. "Place your palm here." Maya pressed her hand against a warm, smooth surface. that immediately began scanning her genetic structure. The sensation was strange but not unpleasant, like being examined by invisible fingers that could see into her very DNA. "The system is reading your neural patterns," Kyle continued. "It needs to understand how human consciousness differs from architect consciousness to properly calibrate the severing frequency." Around them, the chamber's lighting shifted from blue to amber as the ancient machinery prepared itself for activation. Maya could feel something building in the air, a pressure that made her ears pop and her skin tingle with static electricity. 30 seconds, Kyle announced. "Maya, I need you to know, regardless of what happens next, you've saved not just humanity, but every world the infection might have reached. The courage you're showing right now would have impressed even the architects." She squeezed her eyes shut as the countdown began, praying that history would judge her choices with more mercy than she could currently show herself. In the distance, Marcus's gunfire had gone silent. The underground facility hummed with an energy that made Sarah's teeth ache. Ancient symbols carved into the walls pulsed with bioluminescent light, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Kyle stood at the center of a massive circular chamber, his hands pressed against a crystalline console that responded to his touch with cascades of ethereal blue fire. "The network spans every continent," he said, his voice carrying a weight Sarah had never heard before. "My people built it when your ancestors were still learning to use tools. We knew this day would come." Sarah watched in fascination and growing horror as holographic displays materialized around them, showing locations across the globe. Each point of light represented another facility, another node in an impossibly vast network of technology that humanity had never suspected existed. "How many of these things are there?" she whispered. "Thousands, hidden beneath your cities, your mountains, your oceans. We've been preparing for the Devourer's return for 50,000 years. The creatures that had been hunting them, the Devourers, weren't just random monsters. They were scouts, the advance guard of something far worse." Kyle had tried to explain it during their desperate flight through the city's abandoned subway tunnels, but Sarah's mind had refused to process the implications. Now, surrounded by technology that defied everything she thought she knew about human history, the truth was impossible to deny. "Your people," Sarah said slowly, "they're really all gone?" Kyle's shoulders tensed. "The last of the Watchers died 3 centuries ago. I've been alone since then, maintaining the vigil, keeping the network operational." He turned to face her, and Sarah saw millennia of isolation etched in his ancient eyes. "I never thought I'd activate the final protocol in my lifetime." The console pulsed brighter, and Sarah felt the vibration through the soles of her feet. Deep beneath them, something massive was awakening. The facility's walls began to glow with increasing intensity, and she could hear distant mechanical sounds, the grinding of enormous gears, the whisper of air through ventilation systems that had lain dormant for ages. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Now we wake the Guardians." The holographic displays shifted, zooming in on various locations around the world. Sarah saw what looked like massive underground chambers, each containing something that her mind initially interpreted as architecture, towering spires and geometric forms that seemed to shift and flow like living things. Then she realized they weren't buildings at all. "Those are machines," she breathed. "Biomechanical constructs. My people's final creation." Kyle's fingers danced across the console with practiced precision. "When the Devourers overwhelmed our defenses the first time, we had a choice: flee to another world or stay and prepare for their inevitable return. We chose to stay, and you've been waiting all this time, alone." "Not entirely alone. I've been watching your species develop, guiding when I could, protecting when necessary. Humans have so much potential, Sarah, so much creativity and resilience. You deserve a chance to reach your full potential." The facility shuddered around them as massive systems came online. Sarah grabbed Kyle's arm for support, feeling the inhuman strength beneath his seemingly fragile exterior. The first time she'd seen him, she'd thought he was just another victim of the creatures stalking the city. Now she understood that he was something far more ancient and dangerous than the monsters hunting them. "The activation sequence will take 6 hours," Kyle continued, his attention split between the console and the displays showing global activity. "The Devourers will sense what we're doing. They'll come for us with everything they have. Can we hold them off that long?" Kyle's smile was grim. "The facility has its own defenses, but they're primarily designed to keep things in, not out. We'll have to be creative." As if summoned by his words, an alarm began to wail through the chamber. One of the holographic displays zoomed in on the facility's upper levels, showing dark shapes moving through the corridors they'd traveled to reach this place. The Devourers moved with liquid grace, their forms shifting between states of matter in ways that hurt to watch. "How many?" Sarah asked. "Too many." Kyle's hands flew over the console, activating systems that Sarah couldn't begin to understand. "But not as many as there will be once they realize what we're attempting." The walls around them began to shift, revealing hidden alcoves containing weapons that looked like they belonged in a fever dream. Organic curves merged with crystalline edges, and everything hummed with the same bioluminescent energy that powered the facility. "Can I use those?" Sarah asked, pointing at the nearest weapon rack. "They're designed for my people's physiology, but we can adapt them." Kyle pulled a rifle-like device from its housing, his fingers adjusting controls that reshaped the weapon's grip and trigger mechanism. Fair warning, they respond to emotional state as much as conscious intent. Sarah hefted the modified weapon, feeling it warm to her touch. Through the facility's sensors, she could track the approaching Devourers as they descended level by level, growing closer with each passing moment. The final battle was about to begin. The laboratory's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Maya pressed herself against the cold metal wall, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the chaos unfolding in the main research bay. Twisted forms that had once been human scientists lurching between overturned equipment, their elongated limbs scraping against the floor with nauseating wet sounds. "How many more are there?" she whispered to Kyle, who crouched beside her, his ancient eyes scanning the carnage with calculating precision. "Too many." His voice carried the weight of millennia, but she caught something else there now, uncertainty. For the first time since she'd discovered what he truly was, the last of the predecessor race seemed genuinely afraid. The transformation accelerated beyond their projections. Dr. Hendricks wasn't supposed to complete the synthesis for another week. A metallic crash echoed from the laboratory as one of the creatures. Maya refused to think of it as having once been her colleague Sarah, slammed into a bank of computers. Sparks flew, and the lights flickered ominously. "The backup generators won't last much longer," Maya said, checking her watch. 20 minutes, maybe less. Kyle nodded grimly. "When the power fails, the containment fields go down. Every subject they've been experimenting on in sub-level 3 will be free." He turned to meet her gaze, and she saw something that made her stomach clench. There are 47 of them down there, all in various stages of transformation. The weight of that number settled over her like a shroud. 47 monsters loose in the city above. Maya thought of her sister's apartment 12 blocks away, of the thousands of people who had no idea what was coming for them. "There has to be a way to stop this," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how desperate they sounded. "There is." Kyle's hand found the breach charges they'd salvaged from the security office, his fingers tracing the detonators with grim familiarity. "But it means bringing down the entire facility. The blast would have to be precisely timed to collapse all 5 sub-levels simultaneously, creating a cave-in that would contain the contamination." Maya studied his profile in the crimson emergency lighting, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "But you'd have to manually trigger the charges from the central hub. There's no way out from there once the sequence starts. He didn't deny it. Couldn't deny it. Another crash, closer this time, made them both freeze. Through the glass, Maya watched as one of the transformed scientists, this one barely recognizable as having once been human, pressed its face against the barrier. Its eyes had turned a milky white, and where its mouth should have been, rows of needle-sharp teeth gleamed in the emergency lighting. "My people spent 10,000 years in hiding," Kyle said quietly, still watching the creature. "We survived the Great Dying, the Ice Ages, the rise and fall of civilizations. We adapted, we endured, we waited." His voice took on a bitter edge. And for what? To watch the last remnants of humanity destroy themselves with the same hubris that claimed my kind? The lights flickered again, longer this time. In the momentary darkness, Maya heard something that made her blood freeze, the sound of more voices echoing from the stairwells above. Not human voices, but the guttural, chittering sounds of the transformed. "They're coming down from the upper levels," she breathed. Kyle was already moving, gathering the charges with efficient precision. The maintenance shaft behind the central hub. It leads to an old service tunnel. The explosion won't reach that far if you move fast enough. What about you? Someone needs to hold them off long enough for you to reach the tunnel. He pressed a small device into her hand, a timer, its digital display showing 30 minutes in glowing blue numbers. "Set this for 15 minutes once you reach the hub. That should give you enough time to get clear." Maya stared at the timer, then at him. "There has to be another way. My people were warriors once, before we became survivors." Kyle checked his weapon, an energy pistol of clearly alien design that hummed with barely contained power. Perhaps it's time to remember what that means. The emergency lighting failed completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, Maya could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then came the sounds she'd been dreading, the scrape of claws on metal, the wet breathing of things that shouldn't exist, drawing closer with each passing second. Kyle's hand found her shoulder in the darkness, his touch surprisingly warm. "When I give the signal, run for the central corridor. Don't look back, don't stop for anything, promise me." Before she could answer, the first of the creatures found them in the dark. The facility's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Maya followed Kyle through corridors littered with debris and bodies. The screams had mostly stopped now, replaced by an ominous silence that made her skin crawl. Behind them, she could hear the wet, sliding sounds of the creatures moving through the compound, hunting. "How many more?" she whispered, stepping over a scientist's torn lab coat. "Too many." Kyle's enhanced senses swept the area ahead. They'd been breeding them here for months. What we saw in the main lab was just the beginning. A metallic clang echoed from somewhere above them, followed by the sound of air vents being torn apart. The creatures were learning, adapting, finding new ways to move through the facility. Maya gripped the plasma rifle tighter, though she knew it would do little good against what they were facing. Dr. Harrison's voice crackled through Kyle's stolen radio. "Level 7 is completely overrun. I'm sealing the blast doors, but they won't hold for long." "Where's the primary server?" Kyle responded, not slowing his pace. "Sub-basement 3, but you'll never make it. The whole level is—" The transmission cut to static as something roared in the background, followed by Harrison's terrified screaming. "We're on our own," Kyle said grimly. They reached a stairwell where emergency lighting flickered sporadically, creating a strobe effect that made Maya's head pound. As they descended, she caught glimpses of claw marks gouged deep into the concrete walls. Whatever had made them was significantly larger than the creatures they'd encountered so far. "Kyle," she breathed, pointing at the marks. Those weren't made by the same things. He examined the gouges, his expression darkening. "They're evolving, rapidly. The genetic instability I sensed, it's not a flaw, it's a feature. They're designed to adapt and improve within hours of birth." "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning, the longer we wait, the deadlier they become." A wet, bubbling sound echoed up from the depths below them. Maya felt her stomach turn as the stench hit her, rotting flesh mixed with something else, something chemical and wrong. They pressed against the stairwell wall as something massive moved past in the darkness below, its breathing like a broken bellows. When the sound faded, they continued downward. The air grew thicker, more humid, as if they were descending into some primordial swamp. Bioluminescent slime began appearing on the walls, pulsing with an alien rhythm that seemed to match Maya's accelerated heartbeat. "It's spreading," Kyle observed. "They're terraforming the environment to suit their needs." "How is that possible so quickly?" "Because they're not entirely terrestrial. The genetic template Harrison's team used, it's ancient, older than human civilization, something my people encountered long ago and buried for good reason. They reached sub-basement 3 to find the corridor completely transformed. The walls were covered in a thick, organic membrane that pulsed with veins of bioluminescent fluid. The floor squelched beneath their feet, and Maya realized they were walking on something that was disturbingly alive. "The server room should be just ahead," Kyle said, but his voice carried doubt. The facility's layout was barely recognizable under the alien growth. A sound like tearing paper filled the air, followed by a wet plop. In the distance, Maya could see something emerging from the wall membrane, something the size of a small car, glistening with birth fluids. It hadn't noticed them yet, but she could see rows of teeth and too many eyes reflecting the red emergency lighting. "New generation," Kyle whispered. "Bigger, stronger." The creature's head swiveled toward them with predatory interest. Maya raised her rifle, but Kyle put a hand on the barrel, lowering it. "Gunfire will attract everything in a 5-level radius," he warned. Instead, he drew a blade from his coat, something Maya hadn't seen before, made of a metal that seemed to absorb light. As the creature charged, Kyle moved with inhuman speed, sliding beneath its bulk and driving the blade deep into what might have been its neck. The thing collapsed without a sound, its bioluminescent patches fading to black. "We need to move faster," he said, but Maya could see the strain in his posture. Even his enhanced abilities had limits. They found the server room behind a door that had been partially digested by the organic growth. Inside, banks of computers hummed quietly, somehow still functional despite the chaos above. But the room wasn't empty. Dr. Harrison sat hunched over a terminal, his back to them, typing frantically. "Doctor?" Maya called softly. Harrison turned, and Maya's scream caught in her throat. Half his face was gone, replaced by the same organic membrane covering the walls. His remaining eye focused on them with desperate clarity. Had to document everything," he said through lips that were no longer entirely human. "The transformation, it's not random. There's a purpose, a design." Behind them, the sound of approaching creatures grew louder. Whatever Harrison had become, they were running out of time to get answers. The creature's dying screech echoed through the abandoned warehouse as its massive form collapsed, dark ichor pooling beneath twisted limbs. Sarah pressed herself against Kyle's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his ancient heart gradually slow from battle fury to something approaching calm. "It's over," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of millennia. "The last of the Vorthak is dead." Sarah pulled back to look at him, noting the deep gashes across his arms and torso that were already beginning to heal. His pale skin seemed to shimmer in the dim light filtering through broken windows, and she realized she was seeing him truly for the first time, not the man he pretended to be, but the last Nephilim, humanity's forgotten guardian. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Kyle's expression grew distant as he gazed at the creature's corpse. "Now I can finally rest. For 3,000 years I've hunted these things across every continent, through every war and plague and catastrophe. I've watched civilizations rise and fall, seen humanity grow strong enough to defend itself." He looked down at her, golden eyes soft with something like relief. "My vigil is ended." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold warehouse air. "Rest? What do you mean, rest?" Before he could answer, a low rumble shook the building. Dust rained from the rafters as emergency sirens wailed in the distance. Through the broken windows, Sarah could see the glow of approaching headlights, military vehicles by their formation and speed. "They're coming," Kyle said, unsurprised. "The government has been tracking Vorthak energy signatures for decades, though they never knew what they were hunting." "Then we need to run," Sarah said, grabbing his hand. "They can't find you here." Kyle squeezed her fingers gently but didn't move. "Sarah, listen to me. What I've told you about my people, about the creatures we fought, the world needs to know the truth. Not everything in the darkness is evil, just as not everything in the light is good. Humanity is strong enough now to understand that." The sirens grew closer, and Sarah could hear the squeal of tires on asphalt. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what he was suggesting. "You're going to reveal yourself to them." "I'm going to reveal myself to the world." Kyle reached into his jacket and withdrew a small device she'd never seen before, crystalline, pulsing within a light. "This contains the complete history of my people, our knowledge, our science, everything humanity will need to prepare for what's coming." "What's coming?" Sarah's voice cracked with fear. The Vorthak weren't the only threat, just the first wave of many. In perhaps 100 years, maybe 200, others will arrive. Humanity will need time to prepare, to grow stronger. He pressed the device into her hands. "That's why I've waited so long to reveal myself. You're ready now." Heavy footsteps echoed outside the warehouse, and harsh voices barked orders. Flashlight beams began sweeping through the windows, cutting through the gloom like searching eyes. "Kale, please," Sarah whispered. "Come with me, we can find another way." He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I've been alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to care about someone. You gave me that gift, Sarah. You reminded me why humanity is worth protecting." The warehouse doors exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood and shrieking metal. Soldiers poured through the breach, assault rifles raised, tactical lights blazing. Their beams found the alien corpse first, then swept towards Sarah and Kyle. "Hands where we can see them," a voice commanded through a megaphone. Kyle stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the soldiers. His form began to change, subtle at first, his skin taking on that ethereal luminescence, his height seeming to increase as his true nature asserted itself. When he spoke, his voice carried across the warehouse with preternatural clarity. "I am Kale of the Nephilim, last guardian of the human race. I have protected your kind since before your histories began, and I come to you now in peace." The soldiers hesitated, weapons wavering as they processed the impossible sight before them. In that moment of stunned silence, Sarah understood that everything was about to change, not just for her, but for all of humanity. She clutched the crystalline device to her chest, feeling its warmth pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. Whatever came next, she would be humanity's witness to this moment, the bridge between what they had been and what they might become. Behind the soldiers, more figures appeared. Scientists, officials, cameras already beginning to record. The secret that had been hidden for millennia was about to shake the very foundations of human understanding. Kyle looked back at her one last time, golden eyes bright with ancient wisdom and newfound hope, and smiled.